On the 10th of February 2024, an 18-year-old trans girl was brutally assaulted and stabbed 9 times because she was transgender, as concluded by the trial that just ended. This violence, which was carried out just over a year after the horrific stabbing and murder of Brianna Ghey, is part of an ever-increasing culture of violence being targeted at trans people within the UK, as we'll be discussing today. But first, a quick content warning for the following: transmisia, child sexual abuse, physical assault, and victim blaming. Also note, we will be sharing images of physical injury as well as footage of the assault itself, due to a request by the victim to make said footage public in order to raise awareness. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so that we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. Hi there, my name is Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about the Harrow Leisure Centre assault last year, which has finally wrapped up trial, why the victim was targeted, sexually abused, and then stabbed in a premeditated assault, as well as how the UK press has put the victim on trial purely for being trans. Now, it's important to bring attention to these incidents since, time and time again, I've had cis people assert to my face that trans people in the UK do not face any form of violence because they're trans, that any violence they do suffer is merely coincidence, a result of trans people being a part of society. Therefore, it's on us to show how this particular incident was motivated by anti-trans hate, as well as how this is part of a larger pattern of trans people, particularly trans children, being singled out and assaulted. It was 2019 when we did our first video on the growing number of hate incidents, titled "Multiple Trans Teens Violently Assaulted in the UK, Trans Hysteria," a video in which we covered 2 separate incidents that happened that year. The first occurred on the 19th of March, with the victim being a 15-year-old trans girl, Corinne Kratz. As Corinne made her way to a special PE changing room that had been designated for her as a trans girl, another female student assaulted her without warning. Said student grabbed Corinne's hair, ripping clumps out as they threw the poor girl to the ground, before proceeding to stomp down on Corinne's head with their boots. The assault only stopped as a teacher rushed in to pull the assailant away. The teacher later stated that, had they not intervened, there was a very good chance that Corinne would have been killed. Yet, in spite of the quick actions on part of the teacher, Corinne suffered severe bruising, lesions from where her hair had been torn out, and a severe concussion, losing all memories of the 2 hours prior to the assault, whilst also being unable to recall the 3 hours immediately after. It should be noted that this was the 3rd time Corinne had been assaulted by her fellow students explicitly because she was transgender. The student responsible for this particular assault was permanently expelled, though, as far as I'm aware, no charges were filed. Yet the sheer brutality of this attack, coupled with the fact that Corinne was using a separate changing room to everyone else, shows how it is cis people who are a constant danger to trans people, and not the other way around. The second incident took place on the 30th of March and involved a trans child who was approached by a group of people whilst walking along a public path, being verbally abused before one of the group pulled an unknown weapon and slashed them across the face. Thankfully, the child escaped, yet, as far as I'm aware, the police were unable to find the people responsible. Due to the nature of the verbal abuse, police concluded the assault to have been motivated by the child's trans status. The next high-profile incident we covered took place on the 26th of September 2020 and involved a 20-year-old trans woman, Anna Montgomery. Anna was out having a meal with her boyfriend, Jamie, when, sometime shortly after they finished their meal, a random man approached Anna before striking her, smashing her nose and cutting her forehead. Anna remarks that this was not the first time she'd been assaulted for being trans, yet was understandably shaken by just how brazen the attack was, again, taking place inside a brightly lit restaurant. Then, on the 11th of January 2023, a pair of bigots carried out the premeditated stabbing and murder of 16-year-old Brianna Ghey. The press coverage regarding said brutal murder was amongst the worst I'd ever seen. Papers that had accurately reported that Brianna was a girl went back and misgendered her, a 16-year-old who had been stabbed to death after they discovered that she was transgender. At the same time, British MPs such as the Lib Dems' Julie Hines label Brianna the victim as a quote-unquote poor boy. When pushed back on said trans-misogynistic statement, Ms. Hines clarified her intent, adding that, quote, "He was a deeply troubled boy. He needed help," end quote, acting like Brianna being trans was the problem here, blaming the victim for her own murder, all whilst misgendering her, dehumanizing her in the process. This wasn't helped by Cheshire Police refusing to investigate Brianna's murder as a potential hate crime, a decision many of her friends and family rightfully called out. A possible reason for why the police made such a decision came to light when Brianna's friends told the press that both her school and police knew that she was a victim of constant anti-trans hate at school, having been physically assaulted for years, with both the school and police refusing to intervene. This meant police had prior reason to suspect that Brianna was murdered because she was trans, but had every reason to hide said fact because of how their refusal to act reflected upon them. Thankfully, her friends and family kept at it, forcing the police to investigate said murder as a potential hate crime, leading them to uncover evidence that the Crown Prosecution Service ruled was substantial proof that said murder had been motivated by Brianna's trans status on the 2nd of February 2024. This also revealed that Brianna's death had been entirely preventable had the institutions trusted with protecting her, including the police, actually stepped up to do so. Sadly, as far as I'm aware, the police suffered no repercussions for actively seeking to pervert the course of justice or for failure to act in the years leading up to Brianna's murder, as is sadly the norm for the UK police. This is why police aren't welcome at Pride. Then, on the 22nd of April 2024, a group of 10 children began assaulting a pair of 3-year-old toddlers, regurgitating anti-trans slurs at them whilst doing so, all because their father was a trans man. The father grabbed his 2 daughters and fled the park, breaking down crying when they got home. Sadly, there wasn't much else he could do in such a situation. No other parent stepped in, and if he'd laid a single finger on one of the children assaulting his girls, his family would likely find themselves being terrorized by the very parents who taught their children that said violence was acceptable. This marked a worsening state in the UK, with family members of trans people, including 3-year-old toddlers, now being deemed acceptable targets. And the feeling that things are getting worse matches the statistical trend. The number of anti-trans hate incidents specifically targeting trans people between 2012 and 2022 have increased 13-fold. That is an increase of 1,282%. This is the trans hysteria. This is a lens through which we need to discuss today's incident, not as a once-off act of violence, but as part of an ever-escalating culture of violence. A culture propelled by hate groups such as the LGBT Alliance and Get the L Out, as well as the press that has empowered said hate groups. This is not an accident. This is a carefully cultivated phenomenon, a moral panic designed to make anti-trans bigots feel emboldened in their violence against trans people, trans women and girls in particular. Which finally brings us to the case that prompted this video, which began in January of 2024 after an 18-year-old boy by the name of Bradley Harris began flirting with an unnamed 18-year-old trans girl whom we will refer to as Emma from this point forward. Emma and Harris got along quite well, and it wasn't long before Harris invited Emma over to his house on the 29th of January. Now, at some point, Harris asked Emma whether she was trans, to which she responded by telling him no, having been physically assaulted after coming out in a similar incident. Harris believed her, one thing led to another, and Emma ended up performing oral sex on Harris. What Emma didn't know, however, was that Harris had positioned his phone to record her doing so, whilst he FaceTimed with a friend, who later posted the video to social media. Harris began receiving messages telling them that Emma was trans, at which point he pulled a knife and threatened her, forcing her to admit that she was trans. Harris then told her to go, which she did. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, starting with the way Emma concealed her trans status. This is entirely her right. Informed consent does not require someone to divulge their medical history with you, unless there is an immediate risk to your health. Emma had every right not to share her private medical history, namely how she was incorrectly assigned male at birth, just as a cis woman has the right not to share whether she's had an abortion, if she's infertile, or how many sexual partners she's had in the past. The only way her trans status matters is if the other person A. doesn't perceive them as the gender they are, or B. perceives them as lesser because they're trans, neither of which is a genuine concern. What is a genuine concern is the danger trans people are put in when forced to come out. I do have more thoughts on this topic, and they will receive their own standalone video as part of my ongoing debunking series, but I just wanted to start by making this clear. There was no obligation on Emma's part to reveal her trans status, even when asked. That's not to say that I don't think it's good practice in most situations, but it's not necessary in order to obtain informed consent from another party, and she was the one who had to make that call in the moment, not us. Speaking of, when it comes to why she engaged in oral sex after choosing to conceal her trans status, there are a number of explanations for this. It's possible she was afraid that leaving or even refusing might alert Harris to the fact that she was trans. It is also possible that his tone wasn't aggressive when he initially asked her, so maybe she misread the situation, or that she's just a lonely teenager who doesn't want to constantly be defined by the circumstances surrounding her birth. Point is, there are any number of explanations, not a single one of which justifies what Harris did next. Because Harris still recorded her engaged with him in a sexual act, without her consent, publishing said video a clear and direct violation of the agreed procedure. In medical terms, this would be akin to going under for knee surgery, only to wake up to find your kidney is also missing. Harris took from Emma without asking as a means of bolstering his own reputation among his friends. What Harris did was a form of sexual abuse, specifically exploitation, meaning Emma is a victim of sexual violence. This is a fact I've not seen mentioned in discussions regarding the incident, with the majority of the conversation being about Emma's actions as the victim, with people blaming her because she concealed her trans status. They ignore the facts that, at the time he recorded her, Harris believed Emma was a cis girl and thus believed posting said video would bolster his status among his friends. Yet, because she felt unsafe in disclosing her trans status, somehow that magically absolves Harris of his actual crimes. I need to make it clear that Harris engaged in sexual violence here, and I just hope Emma has received support for said sexual violence on top of the support she's receiving for what happened next. It also needs to be pointed out that she was right to be afraid of Harris's reaction, with him quite literally pulling a knife on her. Thankfully, she got away, at least for now, but things could have easily escalated then and there. The trans panic defense refers to a grotesque phenomena in which cis people murder trans people upon discovering that they're trans, particularly those they'd been attracted to and/or had sexual relations with. Emma could have been murdered, and I'm glad she wasn't. Sadly, this was not the end of things. Emma attempted to apologize to Harris in the group they were a part of, and while she was led to believe that said apology had been accepted, the truth was much darker. It turns out that Harris and several of his friends were planning to lure Emma out with the explicit intent of assaulting her, talking in private about whether they should bring weapons, where to conduct the assault, and what to wear to cover their faces. They eventually decided to put their plan into effect on the 10th of February, luring Emma to a local leisure centre. Now, I'm going to play CCTV footage of the attack, since Emma herself has asked for said footage to be made public in hopes of raising awareness. It's not close enough to be explicit, there is no visible blood or gore, but it does show the sheer ferocity of the attack itself. The video opens with Harris and 5 of his friends entering the frame, each wearing a face mask, hanging around some bins, waiting for Emma to appear. After a while, a few more friends turn up, before eventually Emma arrives, carrying her bag. Emma approaches the group, completely unaware as to what's about to happen, placing down her bag before one of the assailants takes a swing at her head, at which point the rest of the group begins to assault her, pushing her to the ground in the process. The video ends with the assailants stomping down on Emma, including down on her head. What we can't really see in the video is the fact that one of Harris's friends, then 19-year-old Summer Betts-Ramsey, pulled out a knife and began stabbing Emma, attempting a total of 14 stabs, leaving 9 separate wounds. Thankfully, most of these wounds were made to Emma's thighs and buttocks, but one to her right flank penetrated the outer lining of her abdomen. The assault ended when some passerbys intervened, causing the gang to scatter. Emma was rushed to hospital where she was found to have a weak pulse, yet, thankfully, she survived. That's not to say she was okay, however, with her clearly suffering PTSD due to the extreme violence used against her. As Emma told the press in 2025, quote, "At times when I close my eyes, I replay the assault in my head and visualize the knife being used on me. I am unable to control it, and I feel at times it is taking over my life." End quote. Emma also noted her fears about the future, stating that, quote, "I am not living a normal life, and I am not sure if my life would ever be the same again." End quote, adding how seeing the physical scars on her body, quote, "saddens me every time I see them, and I feel like I am the one living a life sentence due to them." End quote. She also commented on the sheer vitriol at the center of what was done to her, stating, quote, "In the past I have experienced animosity towards me due to being transgender, but never thought that someone would have so much hatred for me and want to assault me in the way they did." End quote. It is soul-crushing to think about how this young woman's life has been changed by this violence. Even more so when we consider how some people and even national papers have taken to blaming Emma for the violence, as we'll discuss later. Her childhood was ended in the most violent way imaginable, and I just hope she can receive the support that she needs, including therapy. I know how difficult it is to carry trauma like this with you into your young adult life, but things can get better. Another thing that needs highlighting is that the assailants were proud of what they did. Not only did they record the assault on multiple phones, but they then posted said videos to social media. Furthermore, when someone called out Betts-Ramsey for her actions, labeling the stabbing of a trans girl because she's trans, quote-unquote, disgusting, Betts-Ramsey replied by asserting that, quote, it deserved it, end quote, clearly attempting to dehumanize Emma. Which brings us to the trial that just ended. Something else missing from the CCTV footage are the transmisic slurs which were hurled at Emma during the assault, clearly indicating what the motivation behind the attack was. This, coupled with voice notes between the assailants using anti-trans slurs, as well as replies to comments calling out the hate crime for what it was, were more than enough evidence to convince the judge that said assault had been motivated, at least in part, by Emma's trans status, marking this as a violent hate crime. Hate crimes receive additional sentencing on the basis that such crimes not only harm the direct victim, but also harm a community as a whole, making them feel unsafe in public. Harsher sentencing is used as a means to signal to said community that such violence will not be tolerated. Most of the individuals responsible were sentenced on the 16th of January 2025. Summer Betts-Ramsey, the assailant who used the knife, was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months imprisonment for causing grievous bodily harm with intent. She will also serve an extended period of 4 years on license, a conditioned release similar to parole in the States. Bradley Harris, Shiloh Hines, and Cameron Osai were each sentenced to 3 years detention at a young offender institution for the same offense. An unnamed 17-year-old was given an 18-month youth rehabilitation order for assault, and a second unnamed 17-year-old was sentenced to a 12-month youth rehabilitation order for robbery due to them having used the assault to steal some of Emma's belongings. As far as I am aware, Harris received no additional punishment for his sexual violence against Emma. Sadly, this is not where the trial ends, at least not for Emma, the victim. A number of papers have run articles and headlines blaming the victim. This included The Sun, who ran the headline, "Sick Ambush. Transgender teen stabbed 14 times at roller skating party by gang who attacked her for lying about her gender," framing the assault as a response to Emma concealing her trans status, shifting responsibility for said violence from the assailants onto the victim. The Sun also removed the facts that Harris had recorded Emma without her consent from the story entirely. The Daily Mail ran a similar headline, this time reading, "Revealed. Faces a masked mob who stabbed trans girl outside roller disco in revenge for lying about her gender identity before sex act on boy as they are put behind bars," once again pushing the revenge narrative that frames Emma as the instigator of the violence against her. It should also be noted that both The Sun and the Daily Mail use the same photo of Betts-Ramsey with her taking a mirror selfie, presenting her as a normal girl, humanizing Betts-Ramsey in a way that Emma isn't. Now, in general, I think it's a good idea to humanize criminals, particularly with regards to non-violent crime. They are still people, the legal system is incredibly unjust, I get that. With that said, I can't help but notice how this is being done with regards to the white cis girl who stabbed a trans girl 9 times, as the papers make out that it's the trans girl's fault for concealing her identity due to being afraid of this very violence. Though the worst, by far, has to be GB News, which ran the headline, "Trans girl stabbed 9 times at party in revenge for lying about her gender," dropping any and all pretense of balance by completely omitting those responsible for said assault, putting the entire focus and subsequent blame for the attack on Emma, the victim. The fact is, Harris and his friends wouldn't have done this had Emma been a cis girl. Her being trans was the sole basis for said violence. Any claims about motivation other than a violent hatred for trans people are purely meant as a distraction to blame the victim, justify said violence, and make any future victims afraid to speak out. What's especially egregious about the GB News article is that they ran this headline just above a photo of Brianna Ghey, the 16-year-old who was stabbed to death in a similar incident in 2023. I need to be clear. There is blood on the hands of these papers, their writers, and their editors. The UK press has had a personal hand in cultivating the very moral panic that has emboldened bigots to act on their violent impulses, like in the stories covered today. They may not have plunged the knife themselves, but they gave the hand that did the sense of self-righteousness to do so before boasting about said crime to social media. This is why we've seen a terrifying spike in anti-trans hate crimes. It is not an accident. It is part of a deliberate effort to demonize trans people, especially trans women, and we can't begin to tackle the issue without first acknowledging the root cause. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on the mounting violence against trans people in the UK? To what extent do you feel the UK press are responsible? And what words of advice and/or comfort would you offer young trans people such as Emma? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of the wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Got Us a Lighter, Soshlet, Wayne Six Denials, Flynn, and Higgins the Seagull. And for myself, Adita, and Levi, take care now.